Welcome to Statistics for Surveys, Session 2 Tables, Optional Segment 6-4, Formula for Cumulative Relative Frequency. In this segment, I'll try to show you how to create and read a formula for cumulative relative frequencies. It's useful if you understand already what cumulative relative frequencies are, which was discussed in Session 2, Segment 2. That you are familiar with the summation sign and the formula for the regular cumulative frequencies. When we were discussing the cumulative relative frequency, we also discussed that there are a few different options to calculate this. The most simplistic method to come up with a formula is actually to simply replace absolute frequency by relative frequency in the formulas we saw earlier for cumulative frequencies. So if we take one of the formulas for cumulative frequencies and we replace the CF simply now by CRF, and we also replace F here by RF, we get our first useful formula for cumulative relative frequencies. Another formula we saw was using a little bit of sequencing here, and again you take the cumulative frequency and replace it by cumulative relative. The same goes here, and frequency replaced by relative frequency gives you this one. The downside of these formulas is that if you've rounded the relative frequencies, you'll keep on adding all these so-called rounding errors, and that might accumulate actually a little bit. So we therefore actually prefer to use a slightly different method to calculate cumulative relative frequencies if you're doing this by hand. If you're using a computer that does not use roundings for the relative frequencies, then of course these methods will work just fine. So the what I call better method is actually used by defining cumulative relative frequencies as the cumulative frequency divided by the total of all absolute frequencies. So if we take cumulative relative frequencies and we actually abbreviate that to CRF, is of course the equal sign. Cumulative frequencies will abbreviate to CF. Divided by is of course the division sign, and the total of all absolute frequencies can be replaced by N. That then, if we actually compress these, we get the nice looking formula CRF, cumulative relative frequency, equals cumulative frequency divided by N, which is the total of all absolute frequencies. Of course, if you like, you can also use the indices. So actually simply adding the little i's underneath here to indicate specifically which category you are actually calculating the cumulative relative frequencies of, and up here of which specific category, which is then the same, the cumulative frequency you should take. So just in case you're interested, I'll show a quick proof of equivalence of the somewhat simplistic method and the better method, that they're actually, if you wouldn't be doing any roundings, will indeed come up with the same result. In order to do that, we need two definitions, which was the relative frequency, which was simply the frequency divided by the N, the total number of absolute frequencies, and a definition of the cumulative frequencies, which is the absolute frequencies going from the first category until the category of which you want the cumulative frequencies of. So we'll start off with the simplistic formula, and we'll then actually use that definition or that formula for the relative frequency. So we're going to replace this part and write it out in full. Then the next step is to actually write this sum out in full. So we're using the summation, which is the sum of the first frequency plus the second, all the way till that last category of which you want the cumulative relative frequencies. Now for the next step, we're going to actually simplify this a little bit, because as you might know, if you have any number, so let's say A over B, and you have another number plus C over B, then you are allowed to actually add these up, as in A plus C divided by B. So we're going to make use of that in the next step, and simply write out the numerator, the top part of this fraction, as a long sum. And since they're all here divided by n, we can just simply write that down once. Then for the next step, we'll plug in back that summation sign, because so we're going to simply rewrite this whole part into a sum, which is the sum starting from the first one until I, which is therefore this whole bit, and still of course divided by n. And as you might notice, this last bit is exactly the same as up here. So we can replace that by CF, and that's actually the last step. And now we're actually done, because we wanted to show that CRFI, which was the simplistic formula, is indeed the same as the cumulative frequencies divided by n, which was the somewhat better method.